The varnish bubbled, just a fraction. A faint, sickening yellow blister on the canvas where the face of Sir Reginald Blackwood stared out from the gloom. Elias Thorne, the most meticulous portrait restorer in all of England, held his breath and applied the solvent. Beneath that century-old layer of grime and darkened lacquer, something was waiting. A secret strokes of paint that did not belong. As the varnish peeled away, it wasn't the original canvas that emerged, but words. A document, painted over and hidden in plain sight. A forged will. Elias leaned in, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He called out to his apprentice, Thomas, to document the layer. But as Thomas watched the words appear like a confession rising from the dead, Elias's hand began to tremble. He gasped, clawing at his chest, the solvent slipping from his fingers. The secret beneath remained untouched, but Elias Thorne's heart gave out before he could read the final line. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Midnight Pages. I'm Jack, and it's wonderful to have you here for another long-form mystery. Settle in, get comfortable. Before we begin, I'd love to know, what's the one item you own that means the most to you and why? Leave a comment below, I read every single one. Now, let's travel to the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the dust of a restorer's studio holds a deadly secret. Chapter 1, The Commission. It was a Tuesday morning when the letter arrived, slipped quietly between a colourful circular for the upcoming village fete and a rather demanding, sharply creased bill from the butcher. The grandfather clock in the hall was striking a steady, resonant 10 o'clock. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her sunlit parlour with a skein of pale blue wool resting in her lap, examined the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind of heavy cream stock that held its shape stubbornly and suggested old money, or at least the pretense of it. The handwriting, however, betrayed the sender's state of mind. It was sharp, jagged, and agitated, the dark black ink pressed so hard into the page that it had nearly torn the delicate fibres of the paper. It was from Eleanor Vance, the niece of the late Sir Reginald Blackwood. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, taking a slow sip of her Darjeeling tea. The aroma of bergamot and faint wood smoke from the fireplace mingled pleasantly in the room. She knew of the Blackwoods, of course. Everyone in St. Mary Mead knew of them, or at least of the imposing, Gothic silhouette of Blackwood Hall that crouched like a brooding gargoyle on the hill overlooking the village. Sir Reginald had been a man of formidable temper and unpredictable whims, much like the late Mr. Higgins who used to run the apothecary, a man who trusted no one and kept his recipes locked in a tin box. Sir Reginald had passed away some 10 years prior in a fit of apoplexy, leaving his sprawling estate to his nephew, Julian. Julian was a man whose primary talent seemed to lie in spending money he had not yet fully acquired, possessing the reckless charm of young Tommy Abernathy, who had charmed half the village before running off with the church funds. Eleanor, the quiet, observant niece who had diligently cared for Sir Reginald in his final, difficult years, had been given nothing more than a modest, draughty cottage and a pitifully small allowance. But the letter was not about Julian's mounting gambling debts or the crumbling, ivy-choked masonry of the hall. It was about a portrait. Dear Miss Marple, the letter read, the words slanting upward in distress. I know you have a mind for things that do not sit right. The large portrait of my uncle in the main dining room is being cleaned. Julian commissioned it suddenly last week. He hired Elias Thorne from London, a man of great reputation. But Mr. Thorne told me, in strict confidence, that the portrait needs more than cleaning. He looked terrified, Miss Marple, his hand shaking as he spoke. He said the canvas was breathing. I beg of you to come to tea on Thursday to discuss this matter. Miss Marple let the letter rest gently on her knitting. Breathing, she murmured, picking up her knitting needles. Click-clack, click-clack. It was a most peculiar word for a man of science and art to use. Elias Thorne was a name known even in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. He was a restorer of national repute, a man who coaxed lost masterpieces from the suffocating grip of time, a man of precise measurements and chemical certainties. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or poetic exaggeration. She looked out the window. The sky was the color of bruised slate, heavy with the promise of an autumn downpour. The wind rattled the panes, a sharp contrast to the cozy warmth of her parlor. She imagined the gravel drive of Blackwood Hall, how it would soon be a slick, muddy morass, and how the air inside the grand house would be damp, smelling of old wood smoke, floor wax, and decades-old resentments. It was a house that kept its secrets well, much like a painting waiting to be cleaned. There was a concealed layer to this family's history, she was sure of it. She mentally rearranged her Thursday schedule. The vicar's wife could certainly manage the flower-arranging committee without her for 1 week. Mrs. Bantry would simply have to take charge of the chrysanthemums. A canvas that breathes, Miss Marple said softly to the empty room, her needles pausing for a fraction of a second. Or perhaps, a canvas that speaks. And someone is very, very afraid of what it might say. Chapter 2: The Apprentice's Eye. Thomas Finch was a young man constructed entirely of sharp angles, nervous energy, and an unyielding dedication to his craft. His long, thin fingers were permanently stained with the ghosts of burnt umber, raw sienna, and the pungent tang of industrial solvents. For 3 long years, he had been Elias Thorne's shadow, an eager disciple learning the slow, excruciating magic of restoration. Patience, Thomas, Elias would often say, his own hands moving over a damaged canvas with the steady, hypnotic rhythm of a metronome. We are not making art. We are unburying it. We are archaeologists of pigment. We must uncover the underlying stratum without disturbing the soul of the work. But Thomas knew that Elias was changing. It had started on a gloomy Monday afternoon when the Blackwood portrait first arrived in the studio, a large, draughty, converted barn on the edge of the village that constantly smelled of rabbit-skin glue and aged mastic. The painting was a brooding, magnificent, and deeply unsettling thing. It depicted Sir Reginald in his late 60s, gripping a heavy silver-headed cane, his dark eyes carrying the predatory, uncompromising gleam of a hawk about to strike. It was heavily varnished, the surface yellowed and clouded like old teeth, obscuring the finer details of the brushwork. Julian Blackwood wants it restored for the upcoming anniversary of his uncle's passing, Elias had explained that afternoon, adjusting his brass magnifying loupe. But as Elias had examined the uneven surface under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the studio's halogen lamps, his posture had stiffened. A profound silence had fallen over him. Thomas was a meticulous documentarian. It was his specific, critical duty to record every step of the process. He possessed a peculiar, almost photographic memory for texture and color, and he narrated the stripping of each layer in a series of detailed, obsessive notebooks bound in black leather. He would note the precise chemical mixture of the solvent, the exact pressure applied to the cotton swab, the temperature of the room, and the way the centuries of grime gave way to the underlying truth. The outer varnish, Thomas wrote in his notebook on the first day, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet studio, is a standard mastic resin. Applied roughly 40 years ago, perhaps slightly later. But the craquelure, the microscopic network of fine cracks that develop over time, is highly inconsistent. It does not penetrate the pigment uniformly. It is as if the varnish is floating on a barrier. There is a secret layer here, hiding something structural. He had brought this anomaly to Elias's attention over a mug of lukewarm, over-steeped tea. Elias had merely nodded, his face unusually pale, his eyes locked on the portrait as if it were a dangerous animal. "There is an overpainting, Thomas," he had said, his voice reduced to a dry, papery rustle. "Someone has painted over the original. And they did it very soon after the old man died." That was when the physical changes in Elias truly began. He started complaining of a persistent tightness in his chest. A sudden, sharp shortness of breath would overcome him when he stood too close to the canvas. He would sit for hours staring at the portrait, a damp, solvent-soaked cloth clutched tightly in his trembling hand, his skin taking on an unhealthy, grayish pallor that rivaled the cloudy varnish. Thomas assumed it was simply the dampness of the drafty studio or the harsh, accumulating fumes of the chemical solvents they used daily. He urged Elias to see Dr. Haydock in the village, offering to walk him there himself. Elias had brushed him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "It is not my heart that is the problem, Thomas," Elias had whispered one evening. Outside, the rain drummed a relentless tattoo against the high, uncurtained windows, and the shadows stretched long and sinister across the dusty floorboards. "It is the crushing weight of what I am about to uncover." Thomas didn't fully understand then. He only knew that the air in the studio had grown thick and heavy, laden not just with the familiar scent of turpentine, but with an undeniable sense of impending disaster. Chapter 3: First Stroke. The process of removing overpaint is a delicate, high-stakes negotiation between destruction and preservation. One must carefully, chemically dissolve the newer, intrusive layer without disturbing the original, historical pigment beneath. It requires a solvent precisely calibrated to the specific molecular makeup of the intruder. It was early Wednesday morning. The weather had worsened, a fierce rain lashed violently against the high glass windows of the studio, distorting the pale morning light and casting watery, shifting shadows across the room. The air inside was frigid, carrying the sharp, stinging scent of turpentine mixed with the duller, earthy smell of beeswax. Elias stood before the sturdy wooden easel, a small, tightly wound cotton swab poised delicately between his thumb and forefinger. He looked utterly exhausted, the dark, sunken circles under his eyes resembled fresh bruises. "Are you ready, Thomas?" Elias asked, his voice tight and strained, as if drawing breath was a chore. Thomas clicked his heavy fountain pen, his notebook open and waiting. "Ready, Mr. Thorne." Elias touched the moistened swab to the extreme lower right corner of the canvas, near the painted, heavy folds of Sir Reginald's dark, velvet coat. He moved his hand in tiny, overlapping, microscopic circles. It was a grueling, tense dance of chemistry and friction. Thomas watched intently, his eyes darting back and forth between the canvas and the lined pages of his notebook. He narrated the action silently in his mind, translating the visual reality into a permanent, written record. The solvent mixture is applied. The top layer of 20th century grime and surface dirt yields almost immediately, turning the swab a muddy brown. Beneath it, the overpaint, a dark, flat ivory black used to artificially extend the shadow of the coat, begins to soften and blister. Elias paused, wiping the dissolved, gummy paint away with a clean, lint-free cloth. He let out a sharp, ragged intake of breath, staggering slightly. "What is it?" Thomas asked, stepping closer, alarmed by the older man's sudden loss of balance. Elias didn't answer. He simply pointed with a violently trembling finger at the freshly cleaned patch. Where the thick, black overpaint had been, the underlying stratum was not the dark, textured fabric of Sir Reginald's coat. Instead, it was a patch of stark, brilliant, flawless white. And upon that white background, painted with painstaking, obsessive precision in a tiny, almost microscopic script, were letters. I, Reginald Blackwood, being of sound mind. Thomas felt a sudden, icy prickle at the base of his neck. "A will," he breathed, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "Someone painted a will into the portrait." "No," Elias said, his voice entirely hollow, stripped of all its usual authority. "Someone painted over it. To hide it. To bury it in this concealed layer." He stepped back, wiping his sweaty brow with the back of his wrist. "The will that gave Julian the estate, it was fiercely contested, wasn't it? Eleanor always claimed there was a later one." "It was never found," Thomas said, recalling the endless, speculative village gossip he had absorbed over pints at the local pub, the Blue Boar. "Julian produced one dated a year prior to the death. It left everything to him. Eleanor was practically disinherited, left with just the cottage." Elias stared fixedly at the tiny, emerging letters, his breathing shallow. "Because the real one was here. Woven into the very fabric of his portrait." The old man was famously paranoid. He knew Julian would tear the house apart searching his papers. But he never thought Julian would look here. And someone incredibly skilled, found it. And instead of risking the destruction of the painting, they concealed it. Elias gripped the edge of the easel, his knuckles turning stark white. "We must uncover the rest, Thomas. We must document every single word." He looked terrified, yet possessed by a grim, unbreakable determination. But Thomas, the solvent. The smell. He coughed, a dry, racking, painful sound that shook his entire frame. "It smells sweet. Sickly sweet. Like bitter almonds." Thomas frowned and sniffed the air aggressively. He smelled only the sharp, acrid bite of the acetone mixture they were currently using, and the damp smell of his own wet wool sweater. Nothing sweet. Nothing remotely like almonds. Chapter 4 of The Hidden Will. For 3 agonizing, painfully slow days, the sprawling restoration studio transformed into a tomb of unbearable silence, broken only by the soft, rhythmic rubbing of the cotton swabs against the canvas, the relentless drumming of the autumn rain on the tin roof, and Elias's increasingly ragged, wheezing breaths. They worked in tiny, millimeter-by-millimeter sections, moving steadily from the bottom right corner upwards, revealing the painted text line by agonizing line. It was a masterclass in deception, a true masterpiece of concealment. The words themselves had been painted using an extremely fine, perhaps single-hair sable brush. The individual letters were no larger than grains of milled rice, yet they were formed with perfect, steady legibility, carefully blended into the rough, woven texture of the underlying canvas. The dark overpaint that had been used to hide them was masterfully matched to the surrounding colors, the deep umbers and dense blacks of the shadow, creating a seamless, optical illusion that only a highly trained eye, or in this case, a radical chemical intervention, could hope to penetrate. Thomas, his back aching and his eyes burning from the constant strain, dutifully recorded every single revealed phrase in his notebook. It was, indeed, a last will and testament. Astonishingly, the visible date suggested it was drafted merely 2 days before Sir Reginald's sudden, fatal stroke 10 long years ago. "To my nephew, Julian, I leave the sum of £100, that he might finally learn the value of a single note earned rather than squandered at the card tables in London. The entirety of my estate, including Blackwood Hall, the surrounding farmlands, the timber rights, and all liquid assets held in trust, I leave entirely to my niece, Eleanor Vance, whose quiet, uncomplaining devotion has been the only genuine comfort of my declining, wretched years." The legal and social implications were utterly staggering. If this hidden will were somehow validated in a court of law, Julian Blackwood, the arrogant, high-handed lord of the manor, would be entirely ruined. He would lose everything he had spent the last decade enjoying. And Eleanor, the quiet, mousy woman living down in the drafty, leaking cottage, making do with mended skirts and a non-existent social life, was the true, legal mistress of Blackwood Hall. The entire village hierarchy would be upended. "We have to tell someone," Thomas urged on Friday evening, watching Elias sag against the heavy oak workbench. The studio was frigid, but sweat beaded on Elias's forehead. His lips had taken on a terrifying, faint bluish tinge, and his fingers trembled uncontrollably. "We have to call the police, Mr. Thorne. Or at least a reputable solicitor. We are meddling with a massive fortune." Elias shook his head weakly, his eyes fixed on the canvas with a feverish intensity. "Not yet, Thomas. Not until it is fully exposed and completely undeniable. If we stop now, if Julian gets even a whisper of this, he could claim we forged it ourselves to extort him. He could break in and destroy the canvas entirely. He is a desperate man. We need to uncover the signature. We need to reveal the names of the witnesses. It must be absolutely, legally undeniable." He pushed himself back to the easel, refusing to rest. His hand was shaking so violently that he could barely hold the thin wooden stick of the swab. "Let me do it, Mr. Thorne." "Please," Thomas pleaded, reaching for the solvent bottle. "No." Elias snapped, a sudden, fierce energy flaring in his exhausted eyes. "The chemical balance required for this final section is too delicate. If you misjudge the solvent by even a fraction, you could dissolve the text itself. I must finish it. I started this, and I will see it through." He turned back to the canvas, preparing to attack the final section, the lower left corner, where the signature and date should reside. Elias gasped. He stumbled back, dropping the swab. It rolled across the floorboards, leaving a trail of dissolved red pigment. "Elias!" Thomas rushed forward, catching the older man as his knees buckled. Elias was clutching his chest, his eyes wide, staring unseeingly at the ceiling. His mouth worked, trying to form words. The layer. He wheezed, his voice a wet rattle. It's in the... He didn't finish the sentence. His body seized in a massive, violent convulsion, and then he went entirely limp, his weight dragging Thomas down to the floor. Chapter 5. A Heart Stopped. By Friday evening, the atmosphere in the studio had become utterly suffocating. The rain had not ceased for 3 days, and the damp had seeped into everything, making the air heavy and oppressive. Thomas watched Elias sag against the wooden workbench, a look of profound agony twisting his features. Elias's lips had taken on a terrifying, faint bluish tinge, and his breaths were coming in short, desperate gasps. "We have to tell someone," Thomas urged again, his voice shrill with panic. "We have to call the police. Or a solicitor. We can't keep doing this, Mr. Thorne." Elias shook his head weakly, pushing himself back toward the easel with a stubbornness that bordered on madness. "Not yet. If we stop now, Julian could destroy the canvas. We need the signature. I must finish it." He applied the swab to the final section, the lower left corner. Thomas watched, his pen hovering over his notebook, his heart hammering in his chest. The solvent bites into the overpaint. A dark crimson. Mr. Thorne increases the pressure slightly. The crimson lifts. Suddenly, Elias gasped, a horrible, wet, tearing sound. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide with unutterable terror, and dropped the swab. It rolled across the dusty floorboards, leaving a bright trail of dissolved, bloody-looking red pigment. Elias clutched his chest, his mouth working silently, before his body seized in a massive convulsion and he collapsed, lifeless, onto the floor. Dr. Haydock arrived within 20 agonizing minutes, his black medical bag clutched in a grip that spoke of a long, weary experience with sudden village tragedies. The local constable, a stout, slow-moving man named Miller, stomped in right behind him, his heavy, muddy boots leaving thick tracks across the studio floor. The air in the room was now a bizarre mix of ozone from the storm outside, the harsh sting of solvents, and the unmistakable, heavy stillness of death. Thomas sat huddled on a stool in the far corner, his notebook still clutched desperately in his trembling hands, staring blankly at the body of his mentor. Elias Thorne, a man of such commanding presence in life, looked incredibly small and deflated in death. Dr. Haydock knelt carefully beside the body, the cold metal of his stethoscope pressed against Elias's unmoving chest. He checked the pupils, flashing a small light into the unseeing eyes, and checked the pulse points at the wrist and neck. He sighed, a heavy, tired sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. Massive cardiac arrest, Haydock pronounced solemnly, standing up and carefully dusting off his tweed trousers. His heart simply gave out. A complete catastrophic failure. Constable Miller cleared his throat, pulling out a small notebook of his own. Any sign of foul play, Doctor? Any struggle? Haydock shook his head slowly. Elias was 68, Miller. He worked far too hard, breathed too many toxic fumes in this drafty barn, and carried too much stress. It happens. The heart is a mechanical pump, and eventually, all pumps fail. Thomas jumped to his feet, his voice cracking with emotion. But he was terrified, Doctor. Look at the painting. Look at what he was uncovering. He pointed frantically to the easel. The lower half of the portrait was a stark, jarring white, the tiny, meticulous script of the forged will glaring out against the dark, brooding figure of Sir Reginald above it. It was a shocking violation of the art. Constable Miller squinted at it, rubbing his thick jaw. What's that, then? Looks like a document. Writing on a painting. Thomas explained, his words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic stream, the discovery of the overpaint, the meticulous revelation of the hidden will, the shocking disinheritance of Julian Blackwood. Miller's bushy eyebrows rose toward his hairline. Well now. That's a powerful motive for murder, if ever I heard one. But, he gestured heavily to the lifeless body on the floor, the doctor says it was a heart attack, clear as day. You can't murder a man just by giving him a fright with a bit of old writing, lad. He said he smelled bitter almonds. Thomas insisted, tears of frustration and grief stinging his eyes. Right before he collapsed. And earlier in the week. He said the fumes smelled like almonds. Haydock frowned, his professional curiosity piqued. He knelt again, leaning close to sniff Elias's lips, then walked over to examine the open solvent bottle on the table. Cyanide is well known to smell of bitter almonds, the doctor said slowly, choosing his words with care. But there's absolutely no trace of it here. This solvent is a standard mixture of acetone and mineral spirits. Furthermore, Elias shows none of the physical signs of cyanide poisoning. There is no cherry red lividity of the skin, no evidence of the severe muscle spasms typical of the toxin. It was a classic, albeit sudden, myocardial infarction. The constable nodded, seemingly entirely satisfied with this tidy medical conclusion. Natural causes, then. It's just a terrible, tragic coincidence that his ticker gave out right while he was uncovering this document. But as Thomas watched them carry Elias's covered body out into the dark, rainy night, he knew in his bones it wasn't a coincidence. The village would be buzzing with wild gossip by Saturday morning, the post office thick with rumors of curses and heart attacks. Thomas looked back at the portrait. The painted eyes of Sir Reginald seemed to mock him from the canvas. The concealed layer had been breached, the secret was out, but the man who had brought it to light was dead. And Thomas, the young apprentice with his detailed notebooks and his sharp eyes, was left entirely alone in the drafty, echoing studio, wondering what terrifying truth he had just witnessed. Chapter 6: Miss Marple arrives. By Saturday morning, the normally quiet, sleepy village of St. Mary Mead was buzzing like a violently disturbed beehive. The sudden, shocking death of Elias Thorne was tragic enough, but the explosive rumor of the hidden will had already leaked out. Secrets inevitably seep through the porous, gossiping walls of the local post office and the bakery, and the implications of this one were entirely scandalous. Eleanor Vance, the true heir? Julian Blackwood, a potential usurper? The village could talk of nothing else over their morning tea and toast. Miss Marple arrived at the studio just past 10 o'clock that morning. She wore a sensible, heavy tweed coat to ward off the autumn chill and carried her reliable, sturdy black umbrella. She looked entirely unremarkable, exactly like the dozens of other elderly, softly spoken spinsters who populated the English countryside, spending their days gardening and knitting. This perfect, unassuming camouflage was her greatest asset. People rarely guarded their tongues around a woman they assumed was merely a slightly deaf, harmless old lady. Thomas was sitting dejectedly at the workbench, staring blankly at his open notebooks, a cold cup of tea at his elbow. He looked up, startled, as the heavy wooden door creaked open and she let herself in. "Mr. Finch, I presume," she said, her voice gentle, fluttering like a moth in the drafty room. "I am Jane Marple. Eleanor Vance wrote to me earlier in the week." She was very concerned. Thomas nodded slowly, gesturing to a spare, paint-splattered stool. "She said you might come. But there's nothing to be done, Miss Marple. It's too late. The doctor said it was a heart attack. A massive infarction. The police are completely satisfied with the medical explanation." "The police, my dear Mr. Finch, are very often satisfied with the simplest explanation," Miss Marple said, settling herself onto the stool and carefully arranging her tweed skirt so they wouldn't brush against the dusty floor. "It saves a great deal of tiresome paperwork and uncomfortable questions. But I have found, over many long years, that human nature is rarely simple. And sudden death occurring precisely at the exact moment a life-altering, multi-million-pound secret is revealed, well, it stretches the bounds of coincidence quite to the breaking point, doesn't it? It reminds me strongly of the tragic case of Mr. Spenlow in Much Benham, who supposedly suffered a fatal stroke just as he was about to alter his will in favor of his estranged daughter." She looked toward the easel in the center of the room. The portrait had been covered with a heavy, grey canvas drop cloth by Constable Miller, pending further instructions from the Blackwood family. "May I?" she asked, gesturing lightly with a gloved hand. Thomas hesitated for a moment, torn between police orders and the gentle authority in her voice, then nodded. He stood up and pulled the heavy cloth away. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the painting. Interestingly, she didn't look at the tiny text of the revealed will first. Instead, she looked deeply at the painted face of Sir Reginald Blackwood. A hard, unforgiving man, she observed softly. Very much like old Mr. Carmichael who used to run the local bank. He trusted no one, buried his money in the garden in rusty tins, and eventually forgot where he put it. Sir Reginald, it seems, buried his final intentions in paint. She turned away from the portrait to face Thomas directly. "Tell me exactly what happened, Mr. Finch. From the very beginning. Leave absolutely nothing out. The smallest details, a sound, a smell, a discarded tool, are often the most illuminating." Thomas told her. He told her everything. He described Elias's growing, inexplicable anxiety, the pale, ashen skin, the constant complaints of shortness of breath that the doctor had dismissed. He read verbatim from his detailed notebook, outlining the exact chemical composition of the solvents, the peculiar, lead nature of the overpaint, and the slow, agonizing reveal of the words. And he recounted, with a trembling voice, Elias's final, horrific moments, the desperate gasp, the dropped swab, the unfinished, cryptic sentence. He said to the layer, "It's in the..." Thomas repeated, squeezing his eyes shut as he remembered the sound of the death rattle. "And he smelled bitter almonds." He was insistent. "But the doctor said there was no cyanide." It made no sense. Miss Marple was silent for a long, pregnant moment. Her pale blue eyes were sharp, bright, and intensely calculating. "Mr. Thorne was a meticulous man, you said. He controlled the process entirely. He explicitly wouldn't let you apply the solvent to the final section." "That's right. He said the chemical balance was too delicate. He yelled at me when I offered." Or perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, her voice dropping to a whisper, he suspected, deep down, that something was terribly wrong, and he wished to protect you from the consequences of that final layer. She looked down at the dropped swab, which still lay undisturbed on the floorboards where it had fallen, stained heavily with a dark crimson pigment. "Tell me about the overpaint, Thomas. Explain the layers to me." Chapter 7, Layer by Layer. Thomas opened his black leather notebook, finding a small measure of comfort in the precise, clinical language of his trade. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, replaced by a pale, watery sunlight that struggled through the studio windows. Miss Marple sat quietly on a stool, her knitting needles clicking softly, a thermos of warm tea resting beside her. The scent of her lavender soap provided a strange, comforting contrast to the harsh chemical smells of the studio. "The painting is a highly complex structure, Miss Marple," Thomas began, adopting the formal, educational tone he often used when explaining restoration techniques to demanding clients. "The original layer is, of course, Sir Reginald himself, painted by a lesser-known academic artist named Sterling back in 1912. This hidden will, however, was painted directly onto a section of the original canvas that Sterling had left relatively bare, a dark background area meant to be shadow. This new text was laid down using a titanium white base, ground very fine." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, not missing a stitch. "And the overpaint? The layers that hid it? That's where it becomes incredibly complicated and devious. The person who hid the will didn't just slap a single, thick coat of black paint over it. That would be blindingly obvious to any competent restorer. The texture would be wrong, it would sit proud of the surface. No, they built it up meticulously in layers to mimic the exact depth and texture of the surrounding areas. They created a flawless, secret layer." Thomas pointed to a detailed cross-section diagram he had carefully sketched in his notebook. Let me walk you through it. Layer 1, a very thin, perfectly even isolation coat of clear synthetic varnish. This was likely applied first to protect the delicate text of the wool from whatever chemicals or paints went on top. Layer 2, the primary concealment. This is the black overpaint, composed of a dense bone-black pigment mixed with aged linseed oil, used to completely obscure the bright white text. Layer 3, this is the anomaly. A deep crimson glaze, applied specifically and only in the lower left corner, carefully blended to extend the shape of a draped curtain, perfectly matching the original artist's composition. And finally, Layer 4, the overall mastic varnish, applied generously across the entire canvas to seal everything together and give the whole piece a uniform, yellowed edge. Miss Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully with a gloved finger, her knitting resting in her lap. A very, very thorough job. Someone who deeply understood the mechanics of painting and the chemistry of preservation. Someone who knew that Julian Blackwood, or a subsequent heir, would eventually have the portrait cleaned, and wanted to ensure the wool remained part of the concealed layer even then. But they failed, Thomas said, his voice dropping. Elias found it. He saw through it. Did he? Miss Marple asked, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. Or did the person who painted those layers want him to find it, but took terrible measures to ensure he never lived to tell anyone about the underlying stratum? Thomas stared at her, the blood rapidly draining from his face, leaving him cold. You think the painting killed him? You think the paint itself was a weapon? But how? The doctor was so certain. Doctors, even good ones like Haydock, look for common poisons in common places, Thomas. In teacups, in food, injected into the skin, or swallowed in a pill. They do not look for poisons locked within the complex molecular structure of fine art. Miss Marple stood up, abandoning her tea, and walked closer to the canvas, adjusting her spectacles. The black paint over the main body of the text. Mr. Thorne removed that layer without incident, did he not? Yes, Thomas confirmed, checking his notes. It took 2 full days. He was complaining of feeling unwell, tight in the chest, but he survived the removal of the black layer perfectly fine. But when he moved his efforts to the lower left corner, to that specific crimson glaze, Miss Marple pointed a steady finger to the exact area where Elias had been working when he collapsed. That is precisely when he dropped the swab. That is when his heart stopped. Thomas looked down at his notebook, the words blurring slightly. The solvent bites into the overpaint. A dark crimson. Mr. Thorne increases the pressure slightly. The crimson lifts. The crimson pigment, Miss Marple said firmly, turning to look at the discarded, red-stained swab still lying abandoned on the floor. I believe, Mr. Finch, that we need to perform a little scientific experiment of our own to test this secret layer. Chapter 8, The Scraper Test. Miss Marple sent Thomas to the local chemist with a very specific list. When he returned, she had him set up a clean, blank piece of canvas on a spare easel. We must recreate the conditions, Thomas, but safely, she explained, donning a pair of heavy rubber gloves Elias used for mixing harsh chemicals. She handed a pair to Thomas. Safety first, my dear. Thomas, following her instructions, took the dropped swab from the floor with a pair of long tweezers. The cotton was stiff, dyed a deep, rusty red. Now, Miss Marple said, her eyes intense. What solvent was Mr. Thorne using on that specific crimson layer? A mixture, Thomas replied, checking his notes. Acetone, diacetone alcohol, and a small percentage of dimethylformamide. DMF is a strong penetrant, used for stubborn, polymerized oil glazes. DMF, Miss Marple repeated. A solvent that deeply penetrates the skin, taking whatever is dissolved in it directly into the bloodstream. Thomas froze. You think the poison was in the paint, and the solvent carried it into his body through his fingers. It is a theory, she said simply. But Mr. Thorne said he smelled bitter almonds. Cyanide. Yet there was no cyanide found. But there is another substance, Thomas. One used historically in certain rare, very specialized pigments. A substance that smells faintly of bitter almonds when it reacts with strong acids or specific industrial solvents, but mimics a heart attack so perfectly it leaves almost no trace. Thomas felt sick. What is it? We will see. Take a clean swab. Dip it in the exact solvent mixture. Now, gently apply it to the dried crimson pigment on the swab from the floor. Do not touch it with your skin. Thomas did as instructed. His hand shook slightly as he pressed the wet, clean cotton against the stiff, red swab. The solvent hissed faintly. The dried crimson began to liquefy, bleeding into the clean cotton. Now, Miss Marple said, stepping back slightly. Lean in, just a little. Do not inhale deeply. Just a waft. Thomas leaned forward, waving his hand over the swabs to bring the scent toward his nose. It was faint, masked heavily by the harsh chemical bite of the acetone. But beneath it, unmistakable once you knew to look for it, was the sweet, cloying aroma of bitter almonds. Thomas stumbled back, gagging slightly. It's there. Miss Marple nodded grimly. The crimson glaze was not just paint, Thomas. It was laced with a highly concentrated, lethal cardiac glycoside, perhaps derived from oleander or a similar botanical, combined with a cyanide-producing compound that stabilized in the oil but broke down when exposed to the DMF solvent. Mr. Thorne wasn't wearing gloves, was he? No, Thomas whispered. He needed the tactile feedback to feel the surface tension of the varnish. He always worked bare-handed. And the solvent, carrying the lethal dose, penetrated his skin. It stopped his heart in seconds. Miss Marple looked at the portrait. The trap was set 10 years ago. A remarkably patient, remarkably cruel mechanism. But who? Thomas asked, looking at the painted face of Sir Reginald. Julian? If Julian knew the will was there, why didn't he just burn the painting? Why set a trap for a restorer 10 years later? Exactly, Miss Marple said, her eyes shining with the light of a puzzle coming together. Julian commissioned the restoration. He wouldn't do that if he knew a trap was waiting. The person who set the trap did not intend for Elias Thorne to die. They intended for the secret to remain hidden forever. The poison was a fail-safe, a final, desperate measure to ensure that if anyone ever did try to strip away that specific layer of paint, they would not live to tell the tale. She turned back to the canvas. But why the crimson layer? The will itself was covered in black. Why put the poison only in the red glaze in the corner? Thomas looked at his diagram. The red glaze covered the signature, he said slowly. And the date? Miss Marple smiled, a tight, thin line. Precisely. The body of the will is useless without the signature. The poison was protecting the most vital part. Come, Thomas. We have one final layer to strip. But we shall do it very, very carefully. Chapter 9, The Final Reveal. They worked in heavy protective gear, thick nitrile gloves, respirators, and long aprons. Thomas applied the solvent using a long-handled brush, standing as far back as he could. Miss Marple watched from the doorway, her knitting abandoned. It took 2 hours to safely dissolve and wipe away the remaining poisoned crimson glaze. Thomas deposited the contaminated cloths into a sealed metal canister. As the last of the red lifted, the underlying white canvas was exposed. And there, in the same microscopic, meticulous script, was the signature. Reginald Blackwood. And below it, the date. Thomas read it aloud, his voice muffled by the mask. October 14th, 1924. He stopped. He looked at Miss Marple. He looked back at the canvas. He took his mask off, forgetting the danger for a moment. Miss Marple, he said, his voice trembling. Sir Reginald died 10 years ago. That was 1946. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. This will, this hidden, secret will that leaves everything to Eleanor, it's dated 1924. 22 years before he died. Indeed. But the will Julian produced, the one that gave him the estate, was dated 1945. A year before the death. Thomas stared at the canvas, his mind reeling. A later will supersedes an earlier one. This hidden will, it's legally worthless. It doesn't disinherit Julian at all. Julian's will is still the valid one. Thomas slumped against the workbench. It was all for nothing. Elias died for a piece of paper that means absolutely nothing. Why? Why go to such lengths, forging it into a painting, hiding it, poisoning the paint, to conceal a will that was already invalidated by a newer one? Miss Marple walked slowly into the room. You are looking at it the wrong way around, Mr. Finch. You are assuming the hidden will is the genuine one, and Julian's is the forgery. Isn't it? Think about human nature, she said, tapping her umbrella on the floorboards. If you forge a will to steal an estate, you destroy the real one. You don't paint it into a portrait. That is the act of someone who is preserving a truth, not hiding a lie. But they were forced to hide it, because the truth was dangerous. She pointed to the portrait of Sir Reginald. Who painted the hidden will, Thomas? Look at the brushstrokes. The microscopic lettering. It requires an incredibly steady hand, an obsessive attention to detail, and a master's understanding of pigments and layering. Thomas looked at the letters. They were flawless. Only a master restorer could do this, he whispered. Someone like Elias. Or Elias himself, Miss Marple finished. The silence in the studio was absolute. Elias? Thomas choked out. Elias painted the will into the canvas? But he was the one uncovering it. He acted so surprised. He was terrified. He was terrified because he realized someone had altered his work, Miss Marple said. Let us reconstruct the past, Thomas. 10 years ago, Sir Reginald dies. Julian produces a will leaving everything to him. Eleanor claims there is another, later will, but it cannot be found. Suppose, just suppose, Julian's will was the forgery. Julian forged the 1945 will. Julian, or someone working for him. Now, suppose Sir Reginald did write a final, genuine will, leaving everything to Eleanor, just days before he died. He knew Julian would search for it. So, he gives it to someone he trusts. Someone outside the family. Someone who works with secrets and preservation. Elias, Thomas said, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening logic. Sir Reginald gave the real will to Elias to hide. And Elias hid it in the one place Julian would never destroy, the prized portrait of the uncle he was pretending to mourn. Elias transcribed the real will into the canvas, painting it over with the black layer. He planned to reveal it when the time was right, when Eleanor could secure a proper solicitor to challenge Julian. But he never did, Thomas said. Why? Because Julian found out, Miss Marple said grimly. Julian, or his accomplice. They realized what Elias had done. But they couldn't simply destroy the painting, it would look too suspicious, and Eleanor was already raising questions. And they couldn't just scrape the paint off without leaving obvious damage. So they added the crimson layer, Thomas realized. They painted over Elias's black layer. And they laced the crimson glaze with the poison. A perfect trap, Miss Marple agreed. They knew that eventually, Elias would try to uncover the will he had hidden. Or, if he died, another restorer would. And the moment the solvent hit that crimson layer, the poison would kill them, Thomas finished, shivering. But wait. If the hidden will was the genuine one, leaving everything to Eleanor, why is it dated 1924? Sir Reginald didn't write it in 1924. He wrote it right before he died in 1946. Miss Marple smiled, a genuine expression of admiration for the sheer audacity of the crime. Look closely at the date, Thomas. Specifically, the last digit. Thomas leaned in, grabbing a magnifying glass. He stared at the Tifatu in 1924. It's slightly raised, Thomas noted. The texture is different. Take a very fine scalpel, Miss Marple instructed. Gently, Thomas. Just scratch the surface of the dot. Thomas took a specialized restoration scalpel. With breath held, he applied the tiniest amount of pressure to the painted numerals 4. The top layer of paint flaked away effortlessly, as if it had been barely clinging to the surface. Beneath the 4, a different numeral was revealed. Painted in the same titanium white as the rest of the text, integrated perfectly into the base layer. It was a 6. The date was not 1924. It was 1946. They altered the date, Thomas gasped. Brilliant, isn't it? Miss Marple said softly. The person who added the poisoned crimson layer didn't just want to kill whoever uncovered it. They wanted a double layer of protection. They carefully scraped away that 6 that Elias had painted, and painted a 4 over it. Then they sealed it all under the crimson glaze. So if the restorer somehow survived the poison, Thomas reasoned, his mind racing, the will they uncovered would appear to be dated 1924, Miss Marple concluded. It would legally predate Julian's forged 1945 will, rendering it completely useless in court. A worthless piece of old paper. Julian's claim would remain secure. Thomas sat back, exhausted. The sheer malice of the layered deception was staggering. Julian Blackwood is a monster. Julian Blackwood is a greedy fool, Miss Marple corrected gently. He doesn't possess the skill to alter microscopic paint layers, nor the knowledge to synthesize a transdermal cardiac poison into a crimson glaze. Julian was the beneficiary, yes. But he was not the architect. She turned toward the door of the studio. The architect is someone who understands chemistry, art restoration, and the precise solvent required to penetrate polymerized oil. Someone who knew Elias Thorne's methods intimately. Someone who knew he never wore gloves. Thomas felt the blood freeze in his veins. He looked at the doorway. Standing there, rain dripping from a dark mackintosh, was a man. He held a small, silver-plated revolver, pointing it directly at Miss Marple's chest. It was Arthur Sterling, the local pharmacist. And, as Thomas suddenly remembered from the village archives, the grandson of the original artist who had painted Sir Reginald. Chapter 10, Resolution and Reflection. A very clever deduction, Miss Marple, Sterling said, his voice smooth, devoid of any tremor. He stepped into the studio, closing the door behind him. I should have known Eleanor would meddle. She never could accept defeat gracefully. Pride is a terrible thing, Mr. Sterling, Miss Marple said, not moving a muscle. Your grandfather painted the original portrait. A mediocre academic piece, I'm afraid. But you inherited his steady hand, didn't you? And combined it with your pharmaceutical knowledge. Julian paid me handsomely, Sterling admitted, keeping the gun level. He was bankrupt. He needed the estate. He forged the 1945 will, but he knew the old man had hidden the real one with Thorne. I deduced where it was. It was poetic, really. Hiding it in my grandfather's work. But you couldn't extract it, Thomas said, anger finally piercing his fear. You couldn't strip Elias's overpaint without destroying the canvas and raising suspicion. So you altered the date and laid the trap. Elias was a fool, Sterling spat. He thought he was so clever, hiding the truth. I simply ensured that if the truth ever saw the light of day, it would be a toothless, useless truth. And that the man who brought it to light would pay the price. You murdered him, Thomas said, his fists clenching. I protected an investment, Sterling corrected. He raised the gun slightly. And now, I must protect it again. It is a pity, Miss Marple. You are a sharp woman. But you have uncovered too many layers. I think, Mr. Sterling, Miss Marple said, her voice entirely calm, that you have failed to notice the final layer. Sterling frowned. What are you talking about? There are no more layers. I am not speaking of the painting, she said. She glanced toward the high windows of the studio. I am speaking of the village. Before Sterling could react, the heavy wooden doors of the studio crashed open. Constable Miller, moving with a speed that belied his stout frame, tackled Sterling to the floor. The revolver clattered across the floorboards. 2 more officers swarmed in, pinning the pharmacist down. Miss Marple smoothed her skirts. I took the liberty of explaining my theories to Constable Miller before I arrived, Mr. Sterling. And I suggested he wait outside. Just in case the architect of this tragedy decided to return to the scene of the crime to ensure his handiwork remained undiscovered. Sterling struggled, his face pressed against the floorboards, but he was securely cuffed. As they dragged him away, he looked back at the portrait, his expression twisted in a mask of defeat. Thomas let out a long, shaky breath, leaning against the workbench. The studio suddenly felt very quiet, the oppressive weight that had hung in the air for days finally lifting. It's over, Thomas whispered. Yes, Thomas, Miss Marple said, picking up her umbrella. The truth has a way of rising to the surface, eventually. No matter how many layers of deception are painted over it. A week later, the village of St. Mary Mead had returned to its usual rhythm. Julian Blackwood, faced with the uncovered 1946 will and the confession of Arthur Sterling, surrendered the estate. He fled to the continent, leaving behind a mountain of debts. Eleanor Vance moved into Blackwood Hall. Her first act as mistress of the estate was to commission Thomas Finch to finish the restoration of her uncle's portrait. Thomas worked carefully, this time wearing gloves. He stripped away the last remnants of the forged date, restoring that 6. He preserved the hidden will, applying a clear, protective varnish over the microscopic text, leaving it visible for all to see, a permanent testament to Elias Thorne's bravery and the dark history of the Blackwood family. When it was finished, it hung in the main dining room. A portrait of a harsh man, harboring a secret that had cost one life, ruined another, and ultimately restored justice to a quiet English village. And in a small cottage down the road, Miss Jane Marple sat in her sunlit parlour, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm, her sharp blue eyes watching the world go by, always vigilant for the subtle, hidden layers beneath the surface of things. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our tale. The Portrait Restorer's Secret. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the layered depths of deception. It's always fascinating how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, inevitably finds the light. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Which layer of the mystery surprised you the most? Was it the altered date, the poisoned crimson glaze, or the identity of the architect? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please consider subscribing to Midnight Pages. We have many more mysteries waiting to be unraveled, and I'd love for you to join us. Until next time, stay curious, and have a wonderful, mystery-filled night. This is Jack, signing off.